My parents never said much about the garage. That was the whole point. No Gordon, stay out. No long explanations. No dramatic warnings like in the movies. Just a quiet, consistent absence of permission that had become, over 30 years, as natural as breathing. The garage at the back of our property in Lakewood, Colorado was simply not a place I went. Same as I didn't open my dad's desk drawer. Same as I didn't touch the locked metal box on the high shelf in the hallway closet. Some things in our house just were, and you didn't question them. My parents, Frank and Beverly Blake, were good people. Genuinely, Frank was the kind of man who fixed his neighbor's fences without being asked. Beverly kept a handwritten recipe box that had 3 generations of our family's meals tucked inside it. They were steady, warm, and completely devoted to each other and to me. They were not mysterious people. Or so I thought. Frank died on March 4, 2024, heart attack. He was 61 years old, and he went fast, which the doctors said was a mercy, though I'm not sure who that mercy was for, because it certainly didn't feel like one standing in the hallway of St. Anthony Hospital in Lakewood, watching a nurse hand me his personal effects in a plastic bag. His wallet, his wedding ring, his keychain. Beverly lasted 3 weeks. I know that sounds dramatic, like something out of a novel, but it's exactly what happened. The doctors called it Takotsubo cardiomyopathy, broken heart syndrome. It's a real medical condition. The sudden emotional shock of losing a spouse triggers a temporary but severe weakening of the heart. She was 60 years old. She had never smoked, barely drank, walked 2 miles every morning. And she still died on March 26, 2024, because her body simply could not hold the weight of losing Frank. I buried them both before April. Grief is strange. It doesn't come in waves, the way people say. It comes in rooms. You walk into the kitchen and it's fine, then you see the 2 mugs they always used, still sitting on the drying rack, and you can't breathe for 30 seconds. You walk into the backyard and it's fine, then you catch the outline of the garage door in your peripheral vision, and something heavy settles behind your sternum. The garage. I hadn't thought about it much in the weeks after the funeral. There was too much else. Death certificates, their bank accounts, the calls from their insurance company. My mother's sister Patty flying in from Phoenix, Arizona with her husband Ron and their 2 adult kids, who I'd met exactly twice in my life. Good people, mostly. Patty cried a lot. Ron said things like Frank was one of a kind, and Beverly was an angel, and both of those things were true, and none of them helped. My name is Gordon Blake. I'm 30 years old. I work in commercial insurance. I assess risk for a living, which, as it turns out, is the world's worst preparation for discovering that the people you trusted most were sitting on 30 years of secrets. I grew up in this house, 1142 Garnet Street, Lakewood, Colorado. It's a 1970s ranch-style home on a wide, flat lot, the kind of neighborhood where every driveway has a basketball hoop and every backyard has a gas grill someone bought too big. Frank and Beverly had lived here since 1993, the year they got married, the year before I was born. The garage was already here when they moved in, a detached single-bay structure at the far end of the backyard, separated from the house by about 40 feet of lawn. I had never been inside. And I want to be clear about how that worked, because people ask. Nobody chained the door. Nobody put up a sign. When I was 7, I tried to go in once and Frank said, calm as anything, "That's not a place for you, Gordo. Come help me with dinner." And that was it. I came and helped with dinner. When I was 14, I asked directly what was in there, and Beverly smiled and said, "Your father's projects. You know how he is." I did know how he was. He tinkered. He built things. The answer made sense, so I let it go. By the time I was 20, the garage had simply become part of the architecture of our family. Like a load-bearing wall you don't move because the whole structure depends on it staying put. It was my friend Ben Kingsley who finally said it out loud. Ben and I have been friends since 5th grade. He's the kind of person who says the thing everyone else is thinking, which makes him either very useful or very annoying depending on the situation. He came over to help me sort through my parents' belongings on a Saturday in late April, April 27th, 2024, 3 weeks after Beverly's funeral. We were in the backyard taking a break, standing in the Colorado sunshine that felt criminally pleasant for the mood, when Ben nodded toward the garage. "You opened it yet?" "No." "You going to?" I looked at it. The door was painted the same dark green it had always been. The padlock was a standard master lock, the kind you can buy at any hardware store. The windows, two of them, high and narrow, had been covered from the inside with some kind of dark material for as long as I could remember. "I don't know," I said. Ben looked at me the way Ben has been looking at me since we were 10. "Gordon, your parents are gone. You own this house now. Whatever is in there is yours. I know that, so what are you waiting for?" I didn't have an answer. I told him I wasn't ready. He accepted that, because Ben is actually a better friend than he lets on, and he went back inside to help me sort through Beverly's china cabinet. But I stood there a little longer, looking at that green door. I didn't know it yet, but the key was already in my hand. When Frank's effects had come back to me at the hospital, his keychain had 9 keys on it. I had identified 8 of them in the weeks since. House, car, a storage unit he rented in Wheat Ridge, Colorado. 2 for his old workplace. 3 others for various padlocks around the property. The 9th key was smaller than the others. Flat-topped, brass, unremarkable, I'd been carrying it for 7 weeks without knowing what it opened. I pulled the keychain out of my pocket and looked at it again. Then I looked at the garage. Then I went inside to help Ben with the china cabinet, because I was 30 years old and apparently still obeying the rules of people who were no longer alive to enforce them. 3 days later, April 30th, 2024, I decided to sell the property. Not the house yet. I wasn't ready for that. But the garage felt manageable. A realtor I'd spoken to, a woman named Rita Holliday, from a local brokerage, had suggested that clearing and selling the outbuildings separately might make the overall estate easier to manage. She was professional and practical and didn't ask questions I didn't want to answer. "You'll want to clear out whatever's inside before we list it," Rita told me over the phone. "Buyers like to see a clean space." "Right," I said. "When do you think you'll be able to do that?" I looked out my kitchen window at the green door 40 feet away. "Soon," I said. I called Ben that evening. "I'm going in tomorrow morning," I said. A pause. "You want company?" "Yeah, I'll be there at 9. May 1st, 2024, a Wednesday. It was 54 degrees and partly cloudy, I remember, because I checked my weather app 3 times that morning, killing time until 9 o'clock. Ben showed up at 9:02 with 2 coffees from the Dutch Bros on Kipling Street, which I appreciated more than I said. We walked across the backyard together. The grass needed cutting. I made a mental note and then forgot it immediately because all of my attention had narrowed to the padlock on that green door. The small brass key fit perfectly. The padlock opened with a click that felt too quiet for what it was unlocking. I pulled the door and it swung outward, heavy, steel reinforced. Not the lightweight panel door it appeared to be from the outside. The hinges were new. The frame was reinforced. Someone had upgraded this door, I noticed, and they hadn't wanted anyone to see that from the outside. The smell that came out was not oil and grease. It was paper, dust, and something faintly sweet that I couldn't immediately identify. I reached in, found a light switch on the left wall, and flipped it. Fluorescent tubes stuttered to life above us, and I went completely still. Ben said, very quietly, "Oh wow, the garage was not a workshop." The walls, all 4 of them, floor to ceiling, were lined with shelving units. Real shelving, professional grade, the kind you see in law offices or archives. And on every shelf, arranged with a care and order that made my chest hurt, were boxes, binders, framed photographs, stacks of journals with dates written on the spines in Beverly's handwriting. Filing cabinets, 2 of them, tall and gray, stood against the back wall with small label cards in neat holders on each drawer. In the center of the space, taking up most of the floor area, were 4 long folding tables pushed together to form one large surface. On that surface, a laptop, closed and dusty. A large paper map of the United States, pinned flat and covered with hand-drawn markings in 3 different colors. Red dots, blue circles, green lines connecting certain cities, and photographs. Dozens of them, spread across the table in loose piles, some loose, some in labeled sleeves. I stepped closer. The photographs showed children. Not me, not family members I recognized, children of various ages, some as young as 2 or 3, some as old as 12 or 13. Dozens of different kids. Different cities, different years, based on the timestamps and the clothing. And in many of the photographs, visible at the edge of the frame or sometimes directly in the center, was my father Frank. Not sitting beside these children at parties, not at a distance. Close, clearly engaged, clearly knowing them. My legs felt like they were made of something wrong. I didn't know what this was yet. I didn't know what any of it meant. But I knew, standing in that garage on May 1st, 2024, that Frank and Beverly Blake had been carrying a secret so large it needed its own building. And I had just walked into it. Here's what you do when your grief cracks open and something you don't recognize falls out. You stand very still, and you breathe. Because moving feels like it might make it real. Ben put his hand on my shoulder. He didn't say anything. That was the right call. I took one slow breath, then another, and I walked to the first of the filing cabinets. The label on the top drawer said, 1994-1998. I opened it. Inside, hanging files, each one labeled with a name and a year. Dozens of them. I pulled the first one. Inside was a child's photograph, a girl, maybe 4 years old, dark hair, a red coat, a document printed on official letterhead, a handwritten note in Beverly's careful cursive, and a receipt from an organization I'd never heard of, called the Mountain States Children's Aid Network, based in Denver, Colorado. I pulled another file. Different child, different year. Same letterhead, same network. I opened the second filing cabinet. 1999, 2005. Same system. More files. More children. More receipts. More correspondence. More notes in Beverly's handwriting. I walked to the shelves and pulled down one of the binders. On the spine, Beverly had written, "Case notes, ongoing." I opened it. Inside were pages and pages of notes, written over what looked like years, sometimes in pen, sometimes in pencil, sometimes typed and printed. Notes about children, their situations, their needs, what they'd been through, what was being done to help them. I read a paragraph, then another. And then, slowly, I started to understand what I was looking at. Ben was reading over my shoulder. "Gordon," he said, "I think your parents were running a private foster support network." I kept reading. He was right. Or close enough. What Frank and Beverly Blake had been doing, quietly, out of this locked garage on Garnett Street in Lakewood, Colorado, for at least 30 years since before I was born, was operating as unofficial but deeply committed child welfare advocates. They had worked in close coordination with licensed foster and adoption agencies throughout Colorado and several surrounding states to support children in the system who were falling through the cracks, children who needed emergency supplies, children whose foster placements were unstable and needed documented evidence for their caseworkers, children who were aging out of the foster system at 18 with nowhere to go and needed practical support, a security deposit, a used laptop, bus passes, a phone. The receipts went back to 1994, the year Frank and Beverly got married, the year before I was born. They had started this before they had me. And they had never told me. And they had kept it going, quietly, consistently, systematically, for my entire life. I sat down on the floor of the garage, not dramatically. My legs just decided that was where we were going. "Why didn't they tell me?" I said. Not to Ben, just to the air. Ben sat down next to me, which is the kind of thing Ben does that makes him a good person to have in a crisis. "Maybe they wanted it to stay separate," he said. "Maybe they were protecting the kids' privacy. Maybe they just didn't know how. They had 30 years. Yeah, we sat on the concrete floor of the garage for a while. Outside, a neighbor's lawnmower started up. Life, apparently, continuing. I got up eventually and went back to the table with the map. The red dots, I now understood, marked cities where children they had helped had originally come from. The blue circles were current placements or locations as of whatever date the map had last been updated, which, based on a small handwritten date in the corner, was February 2024. 1 month before Frank died. The green lines connected the dots to the circles. Movement. Children who had been moved. Children who had been placed. Children whose journeys Frank and Beverly had tracked from this room with colored markers on a paper map. I counted the dots, stopped at 70, because that's when I had to stop. There was a letter on the table, partially underneath the map. I slid it out. It was addressed to my father, Dear Frank, it began, and it was dated January 15th, 2024, 6 weeks before he died. Welcome back to Sweet Family Revenge. Grab your snacks, get comfortable, and remember, the people in these stories had every chance to behave themselves. They just chose differently. Drop a comment and make sure you subscribe. You're going to love it here. The letter was from a woman named Carol Simmons, and she was the executive director of the Mountain States Children's Aid Network. I found this out later when I looked the organization up online. It's a legitimate, licensed nonprofit based in Denver, Colorado, listed with the Colorado Department of Human Services. I want to be clear about that, because what I'm about to tell you has to be grounded in the real, and the real here is this. Frank and Beverly Blake were not running something secret because it was shameful. They were running it quietly because the work required it. Carol's letter thanked Frank for 30 years of partnership. Specifically, she listed things: supplies purchased, emergency placements facilitated. She mentioned at one point that Frank and Beverly's private documentation had been used to correct a wrongful case decision for a 12-year-old boy in Jefferson County, documentation that only existed because my parents had kept meticulous records when the official system had not. She also wrote, Frank, we have spoken before about what happens to this work when, and I say this with love and not pessimism, when you and Beverly are no longer able to continue it. I hope you will consider what you've told me about Gordon. I think it's time. I read that sentence 4 times. I think it's time. They had been planning to tell me. That is the part that knocked the air out of me, not the secret itself, not the 30 years of quiet work I never knew about, but the fact that they had been building to a conversation that never happened, that Frank had 61 years of life and chose, until a heart attack made the choice for him, to wait for the right moment to hand me something that had been mine to inherit all along. Ben ordered lunch. Pizza from a place on Colfax Avenue we'd been going to since we were teenagers. We ate it on the garage floor, surrounded by 30 years of my parents' hidden lives, and neither of us said much, because there wasn't much to say that the boxes and files and photographs hadn't already said more clearly. After lunch, I started reading in earnest. I started with the journals, Beverly's, stacked chronologically on the second shelf from the bottom. 6 composition notebooks total spanning 1994 to 2023. She wrote like she talked, practically, warmly, with the occasional sentence that stopped me cold. March 3rd, 1997, received word that little Danny was successfully placed with the Hendersons in Fort Collins. Frank cried. He tries to hide it, but I always know. Gordon is 3 years old and sitting on the kitchen floor banging pots together, and I think, this is why. This is what all of it is for. June 14th, 2008, Gordon turned 14 today. He asked again about the garage. Frank handled it the way he always does. Calm, redirecting, no lies, just no truth yet either. I wonder sometimes if we're making the right call keeping him separate from this. But we agreed at the beginning, when he's ready. When we can explain it properly. Not before. October 22nd, 2019, Gordon is 25. He has Frank's stubbornness and my patience, which is a combination that will serve him well. We've started talking, Frank and I, about how to begin the conversation. There's no right way. There's just the moment you decide you're not waiting any longer. I set the notebook down. Then I picked it back up. November 7th, 2021, 27. Frank thinks we should wait until he's 30. Something about that number. I think Frank is afraid. That's all right. So am I. I turned to the last entry in the last notebook. December 30th, 2023, Frank's heart has been giving him trouble. He won't say how much, but I can tell. We've agreed. The new year. We tell Gordon in the new year. No more waiting. He's 30 years old and this was always going to be his. Frank died on March 4th, 2024. The new year came and went, and the conversation never happened. I sat with that for a long time. Ben had fallen asleep on a folded moving blanket in the corner of the garage, which is very Ben. I sat alone among my parents' life's work, and I thought about 30 years of silence, and whether silence is always a form of deception, or whether sometimes it's a form of protection, and whether the difference between those two things matters as much as I'd always assumed. Here's what I eventually landed on. Sitting on that concrete floor, Frank and Beverly Blake were not perfect. They made a choice, a long, sustained, considered choice, to keep a significant part of their lives from me. And I could be angry about that. Part of me was. But anger is a response to a threat, and what was in this garage was not a threat. It was an offering. A 30-year offering that my parents had built, carefully, waiting for the right moment to hand me the keys. The keys they had already handed me, without knowing it, in a plastic bag at St. Anthony Hospital. I didn't know yet what I was going to do with what I'd found. But I knew I wasn't going to sell the garage. You don't dismantle a 30-year operation in a weekend. Turns out, you don't dismantle it at all. What I did in the weeks following May 1st, 2024, was this. I called Rita Holliday, the realtor, and told her I was taking the garage off the market. She was professional about it. Then I drove to Denver and walked into the offices of the Mountain States Children's Aid Network, which are located on Larimer Street in the Five Points neighborhood, and I asked to speak with Carol Simmons. The woman at the front desk, young, efficient, a lanyard with a name tag that said Keisha, looked at me for a second. "Do you have an appointment?" "No," I said. "My name is Gordon Blake. Frank Blake was my father." A pause. Then Keisha picked up her phone. Carol Simmons turned out to be a 63-year-old woman with close-cropped silver hair, reading glasses on a beaded chain around her neck, and the calm, direct manner of someone who has spent decades dealing with systems that don't work the way they're supposed to. She came out from her office, took one look at me and said, "You have your mother's eyes." That almost undid me, standing in the lobby of a nonprofit on Larimer Street at 10:30 in the morning. She brought me back to her office. I sat across from her desk, which was organized in a way that reminded me painfully of Beverly. Everything in its place, everything labeled, nothing wasted. She poured coffee from a carafe and pushed a mug toward me without asking if I wanted it. "We heard about Frank in March," Carol said. "And then Beverly." "I'm so sorry, Gordon, there aren't many words for what they were. I found the garage," I said. She nodded like she'd been expecting this. "When?" "May 1st. She was quiet for a moment. "How are you doing with it?" "Still working on that." She nodded again. Then she opened a drawer and pulled out a folder and set it on the desk between us. It was labeled, in Beverly's handwriting, "For Gordon, when he's ready." I stared at it. "Your mother dropped this off," Carol said. February 18th, 2024, 2 weeks before Frank died. She said she wanted someone to hold it in case the conversation didn't happen the way they planned. Did she know? I said. "That he was that close to, I think Beverly always knew things before the rest of us did," Carol said. Her voice was careful and kind. She didn't say it outright. "But she dropped this off, and she hugged me, and she said, 'Give him a little time, but not too much.'" I took the folder. Inside was a letter in Beverly's handwriting, 6 pages long, written on the kind of cream-colored stationery she always kept in the desk drawer in the living room. I'm not going to read you every word, because some of it belongs to me alone, but I'll tell you the shape of it. She started with an apology. Not a dramatic one, a practical one, the kind Beverly specialized in, that acknowledged what had been done without collapsing under it. She explained why they'd kept it separate. The privacy of the children was part of it, yes, but the bigger reason was simpler. They had not wanted me to grow up feeling like a secondary concern. They had not wanted the weight of that work to land on me before I was ready to hold it. They had wanted me to have a childhood, and then a young adulthood. That was just mine. Uncomplicated by their mission. "By the time we understood you were ready," Beverly wrote, "we had waited so long that beginning felt harder than continuing to wait. That was our failing, Gordon, and I own it completely. Your father would own it too. He practiced that conversation more times than I can count. She described the work, what it involved, how it was funded, through their own savings primarily, supplemented by small donations from a handful of trusted people who knew about the network. She described 32 children by first name and first initial only. Children whose outcomes had been meaningfully changed because Frank and Beverly Blake had paid attention when the formal system hadn't. At the end of the letter, she wrote, "The garage was always going to be yours, sweetheart. We just ran out of time to hand it to you properly. Carol will help you figure out what comes next. And you will figure it out, because you have Frank's stubbornness and my patience, and that combination has never let this family down." I sat in Carol Simmons' office on Larimer Street in Denver, Colorado, for a long time after I finished reading. Then I picked up the coffee she'd poured me and I drank it, and I said, "Okay, so where do we start?" What came next was not simple, and I'm not going to pretend it was. There were months of work, reading through 30 years of files, understanding the network, meeting with Carol's team, meeting with caseworkers and agency contacts my parents had built relationships with over decades. There were legal questions about the documentation Frank and Beverly had kept, questions I answered with the help of a Denver attorney named Rebecca Torres, who specialized in nonprofit compliance and who was, once I explained the situation, genuinely moved by what she was looking at. "This is extraordinary documentation," Rebecca told me, sitting in the garage on Garnet Street in July 2024, going through one of the filing cabinets. "This level of case continuity, maintained privately, outside the system. Do you understand how rare this is?" "I'm starting to," I said. There were also conversations I hadn't expected to have. In June 2024, a letter arrived at my house on Garnet Street. It was forwarded from a P.O. box my parents had maintained, one of the details I'd found in Beverly's letter, and it was from a 24-year-old woman named Melissa T., living in Colorado Springs, Colorado. She had found out through the network that Frank Blake had died. She wanted to express her condolences. She had been 8 years old in 2008 when, in her words, "Beverly Blake called my caseworker and raised hell until somebody actually listened." She was in a placement that was unsafe. Beverly had documented it. The documentation had resulted in an intervention. "I don't know how to say this without it sounding like too much," Melissa wrote, "but I genuinely believe I am alive because of your parents. I have a daughter now. Her name is Beverly. I named her that on purpose. I called Ben when I got that letter. I didn't say much. He didn't ask me to." There were more letters. Not many. Carol had been careful about how she communicated the news about Frank and Beverly, but enough. A 29-year-old man from Fort Collins named Darnell, who was finishing his master's degree in social work. A woman in her late 30s in Pueblo, who had fostered 2 kids of her own. Each letter careful, private, specific. None of them were looking for anything. They just wanted to say, "We know what they did, and we haven't forgotten." On September 15, 2024, 4.5 months after I first opened that green door, I made a decision. I wasn't going to sell the garage. I wasn't going to dismantle it or archive it or let it become a museum to people who were gone. I was going to keep it running. Not in exactly the same way. Some of what Frank and Beverly had done informally now needed proper structure, legal clarity, and updated resources. But the core of it, the documentation, the case support, the quiet, fierce attention to children who weren't getting what they needed from the official systems, that stayed. I was 30 years old. I worked in commercial insurance. I knew nothing, practically speaking, about child welfare advocacy. What I knew was how to read documentation, how to assess a situation, and how to be stubborn about outcomes. Frank's stubbornness. Beverly had said so herself. Carol agreed to be my guide. Rebecca Torres agreed to help with the legal structure. Ben, who runs his own small contracting business and is considerably more organized than he appears, agreed to help me redesign the filing system and set up proper digital backups. We started November 1st, 2024. I want to be honest with you about the anger part, because I think this story earns that. I was angry, genuinely, sometimes quietly and sometimes not quietly, at Frank and Beverly for the 30 years of distance, for the decade plus of when he's ready, and the new year and soon. I have had to sit with the fact that the people who loved me most also, in one significant way, consistently chose to wait. That's not a small thing. That's not something I resolved in a weekend or a month, or even in the writing of this. But I also know this: the children in those files didn't choose to need help. And Frank and Beverly chose to give it, quietly and without recognition, for 3 decades. Those two facts coexist. I've stopped trying to make them cancel each other out. My parents kept a secret from me. And the secret was, they were good. I can be angry at the keeping and grateful for the secret at the same time. Turns out, the human heart has room for both. The garage on Garnet Street in Lakewood, Colorado is still painted dark green. I never repainted it. The padlock is the same one I kept the brass key on my own keychain, where Frank kept it for years before me. The fluorescent tubes still flicker when you first switch them on. I've replaced the bulbs twice, and they still flicker. I think it's a wiring thing. I've learned to find it comforting. The map is still on the table. I've added to it. Different colored dots now, my own additions, cases I've been involved with since November 2024. They're in orange, so I always know which ones are mine and which ones are theirs. Some mornings I come in here before work and just sit for a while. I drink coffee. I look at the shelves full of 30 years of evidence that 2 ordinary people in a ranch house in Colorado decided, privately and without applause, to pay attention. That's the thing about secrets. You spend your whole life thinking they're kept from you. Sometimes they're being kept for you. I think Frank was going to tell me on a Sunday. That's my guess. He always handled the big things on Sundays, serious conversations, important decisions, things that needed space and time. He would have made coffee and told Beverly to take a walk. And he would have sat me down and said something like, "Gordo, there's something I should have shown you a long time ago." He would have said it like it was no big deal, because that's how Frank Blake handled things that were a very big deal. I would have given anything to have that Sunday. Instead, I have a garage, a key, and 30 years of homework to finish. I think that's enough. I think they always knew it would be. If you liked this story, join our community by hitting that like button and subscribing for more family-centered accounts like this.